Washington wants the war stopped by summer, and Kyiv says the pressure clock is already ticking. The United States has proposed that Ukraine and Russia move toward ending active hostilities by the beginning of summer, President Volodymyr Zelensky said after the latest round of trilateral talks involving Ukrainian, US and Russian delegations in Abu Dhabi. According to Zelensky, the American side introduced a timeline framework for ending the war and is likely to push both parties to act within it. He suggested the urgency is influenced in part by domestic political factors inside the United States, which could make this issue more pressing for Washington in the coming months. Kyiv has confirmed it is ready to continue negotiations. Another trilateral meeting may take place as soon as next week in the United States, possibly in Miami. One concrete outcome already moving forward is prisoner exchanges. Zelensky stressed that swap operations will continue and that teams are working on further releases of Ukrainian captives held by Russia. The US has also renewed its proposal for energy ceasefire initiative. Ukraine has agreed to support the idea, while Russia has not yet given a formal response. Zelensky noted that Moscow typically reviews such proposals internally before replying. Military representatives from the three sides also discussed technical mechanism for monitoring a potential ceasefire if a political decision to stop the war is reached. This would include monitoring by Ukraine and Russia with participation from the United States. Zelensky added that the absence of Europe in that specific meeting does not mean European partners would be excluded from a broader process. Key political disputes remain unresolved. Zelensky said Ukraine reaffirmed its position on Donbas, describing the current line of control as the most realistic basis for any ceasefire arrangement for now. Proposals around a possible free economic zone in the region were again raised by the American side. But he noted that neither Ukraine nor Russia has shown real enthusiasm for that model. Ukraine also reiterated its red lines. Any arrangements reached between the US and Russia that concern Ukraine cannot contradict the Ukrainian constitution or national laws and cannot be decided without Kyiv's participation, Zelensky said. While talks continue, Zelensky signaled cautious realism. Negotiations may produce humanitarian results and technical steps, but the hardest political questions are still on the table. Zelensky also announced an upcoming reshuffle in Ukraine's air forces.
The Air Force of the Armed Forces. There will be staff reshuffles, currently in some regions and units, in relation to protection against Russian Shaheds. The small air defense component, specifically countering attack drones, must work much harder and prevent the problems that currently exist. In some areas, the defense lines are better constructed, while in others, there is still work to be done, and a lot of it.
Ukrainian security service drones have struck a Russian military-linked chemical plant that produces fuel components for cruise missiles, according to Ukrainian security sources, triggering a large fire and forcing another disruption inside Russia's defense supply chain. Unmanned aerial system from the SBU Alpha Special Operations Center hit the experimental plant in the town of Redkino in Russia's Tver region. Sources in the security service of Ukraine told several Ukrainian outlets. NASA's firm satellite fire monitoring system showed active burning in the area around the facility at the time of reported attack. The Redkino experimental plant has long been tied to Russia's military-industrial sector and is under sanctions from the United States, the United Kingdom and several partner countries. It specializes in chemical components used in advanced fuel mixtures, including products linked to missile and aviation programs. According to the SBU source, the target was chosen because it plays a practical role in sustaining Russia's cruise missile production. Even a temporary shutdown can complicate fuel supply chains and slow preparation of missile stocks used in strikes against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. While diplomatic talks about ending the war continue, Russia keeps striking Ukraine's energy system with large-scale attacks that leave cities in the dark and put pressure on civilians in freezing weather. In one of the heaviest recent waves, Russian forces used more than 400 attack drones and around 40 missiles of different types against Ukraine's power sector. The targets were electricity generation and distribution facilities, including thermal power plants, substations, and major transmission lines across several regions, including western Ukraine. Ukrainian officials say the damage affected both production and grid stability. Emergency power cuts were introduced nationwide as engineers tried to prevent a wider system collapse. Energy crews were told to begin repairs as soon as security conditions allowed, but repeated strike patterns make recovery slower and more dangerous. The government also requested urgent electricity imports from Poland to help balance the grid for a period. Even nearby Polish airports paused operations as a safety precaution because of the scale of the strikes close to the border. Ukraine's largest private energy company reported serious equipment damage at multiple thermal plants and said its facilities have been hit repeatedly in recent months. President Zelensky said Russia is choosing strikes over diplomacy and is trying to use cold weather and energy disruption as leverage. Moscow has not provided immediate public comment on the attacks. The pattern is becoming clear that negotiations may continue at the political level, but pressure on Ukraine's energy lifeline continues on the ground. A Russian human rights advocate says abuse of Ukrainian prisoners in Russian custody is not a random cruelty, but a system, and she believes the order came from the very top, from Putin. In an interview with Deutsche Welle, Russian rights defender Olga Romanova, head of the Prisoners Support Foundation, said Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees are being held under a separate, unofficial regime inside Russian prisons and penal colonies where normal rules and even minimal inmate rights do not apply. According to Romanova, after the full-scale invasion began, prison authorities were informally instructed that standard regulations of the Federal Penitentiary Service do not extend to Ukrainian captives. In practice, she said, this opened the door to routine abuse. She described the pattern as systematic, not isolated. It includes beating, torture, sexualized violence, and what she calls medical abuse. Romanova pointed to previously documented cases where released Ukrainian prisoners showed signs of severe mistreatment, including one widely reported case where a captive had a pro-Russian slogan cut into his body during a procedure allegedly performed by a medical worker. Because Russia's prison system is highly centralized, she argues such a regime could not emerge on its own at colony level. Orders flow vertically. In her view, only the head of the prison service could authorize such a departure from all rules, and the only authority about that position is the Russian dictator. She says this is why she believes the decision was political and top level. Independent verification inside the Russian prison system remains extremely limited, but testimonies from released Ukrainian prisoners of war, international monitoring reports, and repeated forensic evidence collected after exchanges have consistently described severe abuse in detention. The issue has come even more visible after recent prisoner swaps, when some of those freed returned home with a clear physical and psychological signs of long-term mistreatment, adding fresh urgency to calls for international access and investigation. Brussels is moving to tighten the screws on Russia's shadow oil fleet and is inviting Donald Trump to do it together. The European Union is proposing coordinated action with the United States to cut off maritime services for tankers linked to Russia's so-called shadow fleet and network used to bypass oil sanctions and keep export revenues flowing. The step is being prepared as a part of the EU's 20th sanctions package, timed to the anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. According to European officials, the European Commission has opened consultations with the G7 partners on replacing the oil price cap mechanism with a broader service ban. The plan would block access to insurance, port servicing, certification, and other critical shipping support for vessels involved in sanctioned Russian oil trade. The US under President Trump did not follow the latest reduction, which makes political coordination with Washington central to the the new proposal. EU officials argue that a joint EU-US services ban would hit more precisely and more painfully than price limits alone, because shadow fleet tankers still depend on parts of the global maritime service network. If a direct war broke out between NATO and Russia tomorrow, who would actually win? Not in headlines, but on the battlefield. The Week has published a detailed gray scenario analysis comparing the real military weight of both sides: troops, weapon, industry, command system, and nuclear forces. The conclusion is uncomfortable but clear. In a conventional war, NATO holds the advantage. The alliance outnumbers Russia in aircraft, ships, armored vehicles, and total active personnel. Even without full US involvement, NATO's combined force remains large and more technologically advanced. The key factor is not just numbers, but interrogation, shared command structures, and joint operations experience. At the same time, the analysis notes that Russia has shifted onto a full war economy footing and sharply increased weapons production. Some Western intelligence estimates suggest Moscow is producing more than is needed for Ukraine alone, which may indicate longer-term military planning. The nuclear balance, however, is roughly equal, and that is where the real danger sits. The report warns that if Russia faced clear conventional defeat, the risk of tactical nuclear escalation would rise fast. The bottom line from the analysis is that NATO likely wins the conventional fight. The bigger question is whether such a war would stay conventional. Italy opened the Winter Olympics with spectacular music and a very human moment of solidarity with Ukraine. The opening ceremony of the 2026 Winter Olympic Games took place in Italy, with the main show held at San Siro Stadium in Milan. Organizers built the program around Italian culture and opera, mixing classical imagery with the pop performances and aerial acrobatics. The ceremony began with a dancer from La Scala Theatre Academy who appeared as living stages. Giant papier-mâché heads of Italian composers Giuseppe Verdi, Giacomo Puccini and Gioacchino Rossini followed on the arena floor. Mariah Carey performed the Italian classic Volare. There was also a tribute to legendary Italian designer Giorgio Armani, who died in September 2025. Models crossed the stadium in outfits using the colors of the Italian flag as the national anthem played, and the flag was raised above the arena. The Parade of Nations brought one of the most emotional moments of the night. According to reporters at the stadium, the Ukrainian team received the strongest and warmest support from the crowd, with long applause from the stands. Broadcasters noted the symbolism as Ukraine is going through another harsh winter under continued Russian attacks on energy infrastructure. The US team entered closer to the end of the parade and was first welcomed with applause. The reaction shifted to loud boos when Vice President J.D. Vance appeared on the big screen. The Winter Olympics will run till February 22 in Milan and Cortina d'Ampezzo. More than 3,500 athletes will compete across 16 sports for 116 sets of medals. Ukraine has qualified 20 athletes in 5 disciplines. The IOC has also allowed 20 neutral athletes holding Russian and Belarusian passports to compete under neutral status. That's all for now. For more content, please subscribe.